Hi, and our last speaker of the day, or it should be the first speaker of the morning if you're here in the United States, it is October 13th. This is the day that Pluto goes into Aquarius direct after all its 5 months in there. And it'll be there for 20 years. The age of change, they keep calling it. But today I'm having a great opportunity to have Dr. Tristán Kapp, PhD, presenting out of South Africa, and he's going to share his thesis with us. Welcome. And I probably butchered your name.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity to share this the sentiments and some of my my research with you. I'm very excited. This presentation, I actually had the opportunity of presenting earlier this year in April at a university in France, the École Pratique d'Art d'Études, in collaboration with the Institut du Monde des Africains, I think, the Institute of African Knowledge Systems, which was very wonderful. And so this attempt is merely to explore and discuss the ideas of what is currently happening in South Africa with regards to the, what do you call it, alternative religious movements in Southern Africa. I know my colleague Damon spoke a lot about the Witchcraft Suppression Act, which is also something I will endeavor to, although my focus is a bit more holistic in terms of the sort of approach in general of the positive and negatives of the movements of religious or new religious movements or alternative esoteric religious movements in Southern Africa. So for those of you who don't know me, as Ed introduced me, my name is Dr. Tristán Kapp, and I am a research associate as well as now recently appointed associate editor of the Journal for the Study of Religion, affiliated with the Association for the Study of Religion in Southern Africa. Also a research associate in the Department of Religion Studies at the University of Pretoria, and the interfaith officer and spokesperson for the South African Pagan Rights Alliance. I am incredibly honored to have this opportunity to address you today, and I want to thank Ed and Mary and all of the other individuals whose names I can't remember right now because my memory is terrible and I'm not a morning person. But I appreciate this opportunity and you guys for allowing me this opportunity, and yeah, for being here today. And I'm very much looking forward, and I hope that I will not bore you. And that's why I included a lot of pictures in my presentation, so that you will have the opportunity to not be bored. So the introduction, or the purpose of my presentation today, will be to document and sort of contextualize esoteric traditions and sort of new religious movements in Southern Africa, and examining how these groups are misrepresented and sometimes marginalized since and before South Africans transition to a secular democracy in 1996. The presence of robust constitutional protections amid a predominantly Christo-normative society, despite allowing religious freedoms, has, you know, in my opinion, has, you know, been somewhat limited in a lot of instances. And that is why I have decided to map this discussion, because of the fact that South Africa, when we talk about religion, it tends to sort of not move past Christo-normativity, despite the fact that we have, since 1996, and even before 1996, have a quite predominant, I believe, presence of alternative religious movements in Southern Africa. And this presentation, I have both adopted for the Pagan World Congress, as well as a previous presentation opportunity I had at French University, the École Pratique d'Art d'Études in France, which I was very honored to be invited to deliver a lecture on this very same topic. So the historical and legal context of South Africa. South Africa is known for its revolutionary constitution worldwide, specifically because of its fair, just, and comprehensive human rights legislation encapsulated in its Chapter 2 Bill of Rights, which not only guarantees freedom of speech, academia, and association, but also freedom of religion, belief, and opinion. However, despite such progressive legislation, and our country being among the first to legalize same-sex marriage, for example, these democratic institutions protected by the CRL, Cultural, Linguistics and Religious Rights Commission, in addition to the HRCSA, or Human Rights Commission of Southern Africa, remains unreflected in broader society. Due to South Africa's Christian normativity being one of the countries in the global south with the largest Christian population, totaling 85% of the population, according to recent studies, marginalized identities and spiritualities remain controversial, with individuals who identify as either pagan, Wiccan, esoteric, or satanic, who remain stigmatized and risk discrimination or ostracization from families, friends, and workplaces. We all know the story of Jan van Riebeeck, who arrived on South African shores at the Cape of Good Hope to establish a trade route from the African peninsula to Europe. Yet what is not often focused on is, in the mid-17th century, Christian theology arrived in South Africa. Thanks to the Dutch East India Company, who shortly after their arrival invited French Protestant refugees following John Calvin fleeing persecution to come and settle in South Africa to strengthen colonial ranks. Simultaneously, they brought their own flavors of divinely sanctioned Christian Eurocentrism. Abraham Kuyper, Prime Minister of the Netherlands between 1901 and 1905 and neo-Calvinist pastor, delivered a keynote inaugural address at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam on his theology of sphere sovereignty, which gained traction in the Reformed Church around the 1880s, which later influenced apartheid and remains central to the Christian Reformed doctrine in Southern Africa. But we'll get to that. The French, via Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religions, introduced the idea of chosenness in European Christian identity, which still today lies at the heart of colonialism and imperialism in South Africa. This is a picture of Abraham Kuyper and John Calvin. John Wilson, 1799 to 1870. Wilson was a self-taught Scottish historian missionary who, in the 1830s, gave a series of talks on the Israelite genealogy of the people of Northern Europe. Wilson believed that the people of Britain, later the whole of Europe, were descendants from the tribe of Ephraim. Around the same period, large number of foreign, primarily British migrants, Uitlanders, moved towards the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, as it was known at that time, after the discovery of gold in Johannesburg and diamonds in the Transvaal, today known as Pretoria. The Boer government's refusal to grant the Uitlanders political rights and access to these riches was a major point of contestation. The Brits weren't happy with this, so they waged war with the Afrikaners, and after numerous failed attempts, they had a leadership change who eventually brought 180,000 troops with them and won. This resulted in Afrikaner concentration camps and the scorched earth policy, where a lot of Afrikaner or Boer or Voortrekker farms were burnt down. The Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1895 was a colonial-era British law enacted in the Cape Colony, now part of South Africa, to criminalize practices associated with witchcraft and traditional African beliefs. This law was part of a broader colonial effort to suppress indigenous spiritual and healing traditions, which were often viewed as superstitious, fraudulent, or a threat to colonial authority, as my colleague Damon Leff mentioned in his presentation. The act made it illegal to practice, claim to practice, or accuse others of practicing witchcraft. This included traditional divination, the use of charms, and any activity deemed to involve supernatural powers. Accusing someone of being a witch was also criminalized, reflecting colonial concerns over witch hunts and social disorder within African communities or slave communities, or colonies rather. The law functioned as a tool to undermine African traditional healers, for example, like Isangoma or Inyanga, which is examples of names for traditional healers in South Africa, and replace indigenous justice systems with colonial courts. Punishment ranged from fines to imprisonment depending on the severity of the offense. The act disrupted African spiritual and healing traditions by delegitimizing traditional knowledge systems. It therefore forced many practitioners to go underground, therefore reinforcing colonial perceptions of African beliefs as primitive and dangerous. Despite the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1895, primarily targeting African traditional healing systems and indigenous spiritual practices, its broader colonial agenda was suppressing non-Western knowledge systems, or non-Christian knowledge systems, rather. It also, therefore, had an indirect implication for Afrikaner folk medicine, or boererate, which literally translates to farmer remedies. Emerging from a blend of European folk healing, indigenous Khoi and San knowledge, and Christian mysticism. Boererate flourished in rural Afrikaner communities, particularly during the Second Anglo-Boer War, otherwise known as the Second Freedom War between 1899 and 1902, when access to formal medicine was limited in British concentration camps. The suppression of Boere healing practices paralleled the criminalization of indigenous spiritual traditions under laws like the Witchcraft Suppression Act. As a result, Boer women turned to secrecy and subterfuge to continue treating the sick. This mirrored similar historical trends where outlawed knowledge systems gained symbolic resistance power instead of being erased. See, for example, Tant Mim Fisher's Kamp Dagboek or Camp Diary, or rather, as we translate it in English, Aunt Mim Fisher's Camp Diary, May 1901 to August 1902. Johanna Brandt, photo attached, was one of the most prominent figures associated with boererate and natural healing. She was born in 1876 and passed away in 1964. Not only as a preacher's wife, Christian nationalist, writer, and later well-known advocate of alternative medicine, Brandt chronicled her experiences in British concentration camps, where she witnessed firsthand the suffering caused by disease and malnutrition. She developed a strong belief in natural remedies and later in 1927 published The Great Cure, promoting alternative healing based on nature and diets involving fasting. Yet while boererate is traditionally considered a system of natural healing, even amongst Christians today, its resemblance to practices historically labeled as witchcraft involving the use of herbal remedies, ritualistic applications, and esoteric knowledge has contributed to its ambiguous status. The Witchcraft Suppression Act, as mentioned earlier, of 1895 in the Cape Colony, despite, as I said, primarily targeting indigenous African spiritual and healing traditions, reflected broader efforts to delegitimize all non-European medical and magical traditions, including those of Afrikaner women. Historically, therefore, many healing traditions, both European and African, were based on sympathetic magic, which operates on the principle like affects like. This concept was common in European folk medicine before the Aufklärung or Enlightenment era, and remnants of these beliefs converged with boererate. Johanna Brandt's The Great Cure not only promoted fasting and natural remedies, but it also included vibrational healing, similar to esoteric traditions such as Reiki and pranic healing. Additionally, Brandt believed in spiritual purification through diet, a concept that aligns with asceticism, the works of Austrian occultist Rudolf Steiner, and the Indian Ayurveda. Brandt's emphasis on alternative knowledge systems and natural healing also placed her at odds with mainstream medical science, such as like how witches and cunning folk, i.e., for example, African American conjure, were historically marginalized. From an esoteric perspective, boererate, therefore, despite still being widely practiced among Afrikaner Christians today, incorporates magical thinking, superstition, symbolic healing, and ritualistic elements inherent to pagan folk magic, witchcraft, and various occult traditions such as white magic. Skeletons of the NG Kerk, Super Afrikaners, Freemasonry and Occultism. So I have attached a Dutch anecdote from 1914 that says that met de vrouwheid van den Afrikaner gaat zeer goed samen een ingeworteld geloof aan de duivel en spoken. Ja, zo diep wortelt het geloof in spoken dat men er openlijk vooruitkomt. Als bijgeloof wordt het nauwelijks gerekend. The piety of the Afrikaner goes well with an ingrained belief in the devil and ghosts. Indeed, the belief in ghosts is so deeply rooted that one openly admits it. It is hardly considered superstition. Johannes Bertus de Villiers, former lecturer in journalism at the University of Stellenbosch, compiled the most comprehensive historiography on this. The history of, or the pre-apartheid history of the Afrikaners' relationship with the occult in South Africa. De Villiers covers timelines ranging from the Anglo-Boer War to the late 1980s Afrikaner Broederbond, or the Afrikaner Brotherhood, a male fraternity in the 1980s, in about 351 pages. Between 1870 and 1980 emerges a complex tapestry of spiritualism, esoteric interests, and occult societies among Afrikaner figures, writers, generals, and statesmen, including literature engaging with or being associated with occult and spiritualist movements or practices. During the late 19th and early 20th century, South Africa, like many parts of the Western world, experienced an occult revival of its own, marked by a fascination with occulture, like seances, spirit communication, divination, Freemasonry, and occult knowledge. Afrikaner society, despite deeply rooted in Reformed Calvinism, exhibited a complex interpolation and relationship with these movements. While mainstream religious institutions such as the NG Kerk, otherwise known as the DR or Dutch Reformed Church, often viewed occult practices with suspicion, a segment of the Afrikaner community or population continued to explore alternative spiritual healing practices. This exploration can be seen as a response to the socio-cultural upheavals of the time, including colonialism and the Anglo-Boer War, or so-called freedom wars, leading individuals to seek meaning beyond conventional religious frameworks. A famous figure, for example, in Afrikaner culture was Siener or Nicolaas van Rensburg, who was one of the most prominent historical seers in the Afrikaner tradition, who, according to legends, was a sort of an advisor to General Koos Tellerey during the Freedom Wars or Boer Wars. Die Huisgenoot and Die Brandwag, for example, were prominent Afrikaner tabloid publications which, during this period, served as popular resources for Afrikaans cultural, literary, and societal discourse. Therefore, in tandem, they sometimes featured articles on spiritualism, esoteric practices, and profiles of individuals involved in such movements. They played a pivotal role in both reflecting and shaping public perceptions of occult practices within Afrikaner society. Some notable Afrikaner literary and cultural figures were such as C.J. Langenhoven, C. Louis Leipold, Etienne Leroux, and G.A. Watermeyer, alongside contemporaries like J.S. Rabie and Bartu Smit, who were collectively influenced by the esoteric fin de siècle or cultural undercurrents of their time. Another example is journalist Helen Rabie, or Helene Rabie, author of My Life as a Diviner or My Lewe as 'n Siener, and contributor to the esoteric magazine called Odyssey, which still operates today. She documented her seances with UFO claimant Elizabeth Klarer and spiritualist writer Thys Sadi. It is worth noting that Elizabeth Klarer was the very first documented case of a person encountering or espousing to encounter extraterrestrial individuals and figures. A South African woman and esoteric celebrity later. Later on, there was also Phil Botha, once known as Magus Thor Auna, who claimed to be South Africa's first high priest of Satan in 1951 before reinventing himself as a Christian doctor of psychology. Even children's media reflected these sort of undercurrents. Verna Vels' stories of the bumbling witch Lavinia, which began as a radio tale and later aired on SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation television, shaping the imagination of many Christian Afrikaans-speaking children in South Africa. Such as myself, I grew up with these stories as a young boy. These diverse engagements with the occult and spiritualist ideas among Afrikaners can be seen as responses to shifting social identities and existential uncertainty, a means of resilience, self-expression, and religious experimentation with the taboo. Between 1870 and 1980, Afrikaner involvement with esotericism, from Siener van Rensburg's visions to Louis Leipold's mystical prose and Rabi's spiritual journalism, reveals a culture negotiating with the tension between tradition and transgression. Publications like Die Huisgenoot and Die Brandwag captured this interplay, chronicling a society seeking meaning at the crossroads of faith, modernity, and the occult. Now, the earlier Colonial Witchcraft Suppression Act was directly incorporated into the jurisprudence of unionized South Africa when the British Empire and South Africa essentially became a union government, giving birth to the Witchcraft Suppression Act 3 of 1957, an apartheid-era South African law that further criminalized various practices related to witchcraft, sorcery, and accusations of witchcraft. Despite enacted during the apartheid era, it endures into the present day. In its apartheid context, the law was designed to suppress traditional African or Bantu spiritual practices, particularly those involving witchcraft, healing, and/or ancestral veneration, reflecting both British colonial and Afrikaner Christian Calvinist influences on South African legal frameworks. Yet, despite being in contrast to the Constitution of 1996 later on, witch hunts and violent reprisals were and still are common in some rural communities. Any claim to possess supernatural powers for divination, cursing, or harming others is prohibited by law in contemporaneity. This effectively criminalizes traditional healers, diviners, isangoma, and folk practice, like witch doctors, who rely on spiritual or supernatural explanations for their epistemologies and understandings of the world. It is also an offense to use or pretend to use occult powers to cause harm, fear, or damage to persons or property. I've written a publication on this called The Devil Made Me Do It, Pseudo-Occult Crime in Southern Africa, where I sort of elaborate on this idea of occult crime in Southern Africa and how this constitutional or this claim of occult crime in Southern Africa is somewhat legally indefensible in sort of claiming someone being occult criminally involved. But I'll talk about that a bit later. The law therefore presupposes that the occult and esoteric spiritualities and their practitioners are therefore automatically harmful in nature, reinforcing Western legal, Christonormative, and medical perspectives, dismissing the inherent validity of non-Christonormative cultural beliefs. Apartheid authorities therefore used the church and the courts to suppress African indigenous epistemologies, considering traditional healing as superstition or fraud. The law reflects Christian missionary influences which sought to replace indigenous spiritual beliefs with Western medicine and Christian beliefs. It disproportionately targeted African communities, particularly in rural areas where belief in witchcraft in, for example, the indigenous languages referred to as Tagati or Umtagati, for example, fails to sorry, I have just lost my place now. It disproportionately targeted African communities, particularly in rural areas where belief in witchcraft, commonly known as Tagati or Umtagati and ancestors, remained very strong. The act has been widely criticized for being outdated and discriminatory, as it fails to distinguish between harmful practices and legitimate traditional healing. Many Isangoma and Inyanga, or herbalists, operate under legal uncertainty, as their spiritual practices could be deemed illegal. However, we do have today certain communities such as the Traditional Healers Organization and other regulatory bodies that protect and regulate the traditional health community in Southern Africa. While the Act criminalizes accusations of witchcraft, witch hunts continue in South Africa, often resulting in violence, murder, and exile, communities often take the law into their own hands, punishing alleged witches despite legal prohibitions. The Act clashes, therefore, with constitutional rights to freedom of religion and cultural expression in post-apartheid South Africa. Critics therefore argue that it reflects colonial-era biases, failing to acknowledge the legitimacy of African spiritual traditions. The Witchcraft Suppression Act 3 of 1957 remains a controversial and contested, outdated piece of legislation that criminalizes indigenous African spiritual practices, contemporary witchcraft practices, and bona fide religious practices, while failing to prevent witchcraft-related violence. Calls for reform, therefore, highlight the need for a legal framework that respects cultural beliefs while protecting individuals from harm and false accusations. The South African Pagan Rights Alliance has been at the forefront of this discourse. Apartheid's dying woes, Satanists, witches, and Isangoma. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, South Africa witnessed a surge in public concern over alleged satanic activities. This phenomenon was nearing the end of apartheid, where there was a widespread fear of communists and black majority rule, and it mirrored similar satanic panics occurring globally. However, instead of South Africa's satanic panic being a diffusionist phenomenon, as some people might perceive, it was uniquely influenced by the nation's socio-political context. Sensationalist media coverage amplified fears, often depicting youth subcultures such as heavy metal music fans and those interested in alternative spiritualities as being involved in Satanism. These portrayals contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion. In response to this growing public anxiety, the South African Police Service was the very first of its kind in the entire globe, which established an occult-related crimes unit, founded by Colonel Kobus Jonker, known as Donker Jonker, or the Hound of God, a born-again Christian, and which spearheaded the unit to investigate crimes purportedly linked to the occult. Jonker, also known as Donker Jonker or God's Detective, led the unit until his retirement in 2001, and then the unit's creation was influenced by prevailing moral panic and reflected societal fears of the time. Titles like Satanism Exposed by Kobus Jonker and other sensationalist works portrayed occult crime as a national crisis and a threat to white Christianity. Many works combined eyewitness accounts with religious polemicism and often lacking rigorous evidence, but proving highly exaggerated, influential claims in stoking public fears. Jonker also authored books like Youth and Satanism Exposed, as well as Satanism in South Africa, which argued that occult practices were directly linked to rising crime and social decay in South Africa. Other figures such as Rodney Seal, who was an evangelist and former police officer, as well as prominent speaker on occult dangers, wrote and distributed pamphlets and books at schools warning against the spread of Satanism in South Africa. Also delivering talks in churches, schools, and police training programs advocating strict vigilance against occult influences in the country. Sorry, my alarm just went off. delivering talks in churches, schools, and police training programs advocating strict vigilance against occult influences, teaching that heavy metal music, Dungeons and Dragons, and alternative spirituality were gateways to Satanism. Attie Lamprecht, former detective in the South African Police's Occult-Related Crimes Unit, otherwise known as ORCU, and later a senior government official, worked alongside Kobus Jonker in the Occult Crimes Unit, investigating alleged satanic-related crimes and ritual abuse cases. Lamprecht became a key spokesperson for the South African government's stance on Satanism and the occult, particularly during the 1990s moral panic. Assisted in training police officers on identifying and handling occult-related cases, including those allegedly involving ritual murders and satanic recruitment in schools. Lamprecht frequently collaborated with religious groups to develop strategies for combating occult influences in South Africa, provided expert testimony in court cases and public hearings related to occult crime. There was also the pastor Neville Goldman, who was an infamous pastor and anti-occult educator. These are some of the notable South African universities that have dedicated advanced non-confessional academic scholarship critically evaluating satanic panic myths in Southern Africa. You've got Dr. Daniel Dunbar and Professor Sandra Swart from the University of Stellenbosch Department of History. Then, of course, there's me, a part of the University of Pretoria Department of Religion Studies. Then there is Christina Engela, a very good colleague of mine who started this entire discourse of debunking satanic myths in academia, who is currently busy with her PhD at the University of the Western Cape. And then there is the Professor Lee Sharnik Udemans, as well as Dr. Dale Wallace from the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, University of KwaZulu-Natal. And finally, the most brilliant of all and my favorite of all, Professor Nikki Valkhoff at the Center for Diversity Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. I recently had the privilege of collaborating with her on her book, The Devil Made Me Do It, Understanding Occult Crime in South Africa, which was published earlier this year. Satanism in post-apartheid South Africa, academia and moral panic evangelists. The period from the 1980s to 1996 in South Africa is remembered as one in which the fear of occult crime and Satanism became a potent social force. Tabloid headlines and articles in publications such as Die Huisgenoot amplified fears by reporting on alleged ritual crimes, occult gatherings, and satanic influence among youth subcultures. Remember, we spoke earlier about The Housemate as one of the main publications that's contributed to a societal zeitgeist on the occult. Again, in this sort of period, it sort of took a different stance and amplified fears. Reports often linked heavy metal music, alternative spiritual practices, and even certain youth fashions to Satanism. The last years of apartheid and the turbulent transition period heightened social anxieties. For segments of a deeply conservative, predominantly white population, occult claims became intertwined with broader fears about societal decay, moral relativism, and the perceived collapse of traditional values and a fear of communism. Similar to global satanic panics, local narratives emphasized a hidden network or a hidden cabal of ritualistic crime and demonic worship. These narratives provided a convenient scapegoat amid socio-political unrest. Some scholars and theologians critiqued the conflation of genuine criminality with alternative spiritual practices, arguing that panic was fueled by ideological biases rather than verifiable evidence. These debates were reflected in both academic journals and public sermons. However, anti-occult figures such as Kobus Jonker, Rodney Seal, and others played central roles in shaping public perceptions on this matter, which still endure to this day. The creation and actions of the SA Police's Occult Crimes Unit, led by figures with strong religious convictions, exemplified the state's attempt to address and sometimes exaggerate these perceived threats. Together, these dynamics illustrate how a combination of fear and controversy surrounding occult practices during a turbulent time in South African history marked the adoption of the Constitution in 1996, which marked a fundamental shift in the country's legal and political landscape, particularly regarding these phenomena. As a result, under Section 15, all individuals were guaranteed the right to hold and practice religious or non-religious belief without fear of persecution or discrimination. This provision had significant legal, social, and political consequences, particularly in undoing apartheid-era religious hegemony, challenging anti-occult laws, and ensuring greater religious plurality. Tradition or transgression. Freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, the impact of Section 15 of the South African Constitution. Section 15 of the South African Constitution, as I mentioned earlier, guarantees the right to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, providing a legal foundation for diverse religious expressions. This constitutional protection has significantly impacted organizations such as the Pagan Federation of South Africa, South African Pagan Rights Alliance, South African Pagan Council, as well as others. The PFSA, for example, is a league of members with varying beliefs and practices, including but not limited to witchcraft, Druidry, shamanism, asatru, and Celtic paganism. And its application is open to all individuals and or groups who align themselves to the principles and goals stated in their constitution. Its first annual National General Conference took place in Cape Town in June 1996, at which Donna Vos was elected as its first president. Norman Geldenhuys, Quasimodo, took over as president from Vos in 1999 until 2006. Many diverse groups have subsequently been formed and reflects the independent spirit of diversity so characteristic of the modern pagan movement in South Africa. No one pagan group or person may be said to speak for all pagans in South Africa. The South African Pagan Rights Alliance, for example, however, was established in 2004 to advocate for the rights of pagans and individuals accused of witchcraft. SAPRA operates under the protections afforded by Section 15. SAPRA therefore actively campaigns against witchcraft accusations and related human rights abuses, highlighting cases where individuals have been persecuted due to allegations of witchcraft. The organization has questioned the constitutionality of the Witchcraft Suppression Act 3 of 1957, arguing that it infringes upon the rights guaranteed by Section 15, as highlighted by my colleague Damon Leff. Through initiatives like the 30 Days of Advocacy Against Witchcraft Accusations and Witch Hunts, SAPRA has raised awareness about the dangers of witch hunts and promotes the rights of those practicing pagan religions. The SAPC, which is the South African Pagan Council, was inaugurated alongside SAPRA in 2006 and identifies as a unifying body of like-minded pagans with a vision of cooperative unity. With this in mind, they encourage the cross-pollination of groups and individuals, always remembering to respect each other's traditions without attempting to reinforce their own. In September 2007, many representatives of existing South African pagan covens and organizations met in Melville, Johannesburg, to discuss the imminent threat of the Witchcraft Suppression Bill. This meeting reflected or elected 5 self-defined witches to act as representatives under the auspices of the South African Pagan Council, in order to fulfill what has become known as the Melville Mandate. The Melville Mandate sought to initiate urgent legislative reform to the Witchcraft Suppression Act in order to prevent any further or future unfair discrimination and prejudice against citizens of a free and democratic country founded on the recognition of human dignity, equality for all, irrespective of religion or belief, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms for all South African citizens equally. The Melville Mandate also sought to reclaim the terms witch and witchcraft within a modern pagan framework, and its representatives were tasked with fulfilling the goal of reclaiming through various educational and other processes, including the possible establishment of a formal commission of inquiry to investigate ongoing violence against innocent persons accused of practicing witchcraft. However, the South African Satanic Church, founded by Rian Swiegelaar and Audrey Norton in February of 2020, was the first officially registered satanic organization in South Africa. Modeled in part on the Satanic Temple in the United States, it represented individuals who view Satan not as spiritual deity or entity, nor an embodiment of evil, but as a symbol of freedom, self-empowerment, and rational inquiry. The SAEC sought to educate the public, challenge the lingering satanic panic narratives, and advocate for secularism in South African public institutions and religious inclusivity under South Africa's constitutional protections. Its headquarters in Century City, Cape Town, provided a community for a select few self-described self-seekers, individuals marginalized by mainstream religion and drawn to a spiritual autonomy. Audrey Norton, a self-proclaimed psychic medium, framed her work around healing and intuitive insight, positioning herself as a bridge between spirituality and psychological well-being. Rian Swiegelaar, on the other hand, regarded as the theological architect and public face of the Satanic Church, offered workshops on intuitive development and practical magic while contextualizing Satanism within Afrikaans cultural identity. Together, they aimed to legitimize Satanism as a modern spiritual path centered on self-knowledge, liberation, and personal responsibility in post-apartheid South Africa. Later, however, they would both revert back to Christianity and now act as anti-occult conspiritualist activists or textbook Christian moral panic grifters, profiteering from appeals to authority as ex-Satanists, scamming people out of their money with spiritual warfare courses and invoking alarmist conspiracies reminiscent of an apartheid past. Swiegelaar therefore plagiarized the sales pitches of anti-occult evangelical grifters like John Ramirez and Rebecca Brown, who popularized the act of turning exaggerated cult controversies into quasi-survivor shock testimonies, selling thought-terminating cliches in a French church enterprise filled with gullible housewives. After all, if you want to be rich and not pay taxes in South Africa, build a church. The media in post-apartheid South Africa still struggle with accurate, non-stigmatic representations of alternative belief systems in South Africa. After its registration in February 2020, the South African Satanic Church sought to expand beyond its Cape Town base by creating regional chapters to decentralize leadership, support local communities, and promote religious pluralism in a climate of moral panic. The Gauteng chapter, which I led as head reverend from Pretoria, became the most active and visible branch, using public education, scholarship, and video readings, as well as media engagement to demystify Satanism and the occult, as well as lend academic credibility to the movement. It was also the only chapter to host in-person gatherings, most notably the Satanic Braai, which is a satanic barbecue, ironically enough. No animals were harmed in the process, and we also included vegans, creating a rare space for open dialogue and inclusion. The Port Elizabeth chapter, later, chapter headed by researcher Christina Engela, remained relatively inactive with few genuine members and limited public engagement. By January 2021, the SAEC dissolved all regional chapters, officially citing COVID-19 restrictions, but also reflecting internal leadership tensions, dwindling membership, and over-centralization. Together, these chapters represented the SAEC's brief but significant experiment in building legitimacy, community, and visibility for alternative spirituality in post-apartheid South Africa. The SAEC also faced significant backlash from fundamentalist Christian groups and anti-occult activists, including accusations of the infamous satanic ritual abuse, animal sacrifice, and devil worship, despite no evidence supporting such claims. Opposition from conservative religious leaders who called for government intervention to ban the organization. Social stigma and threats directed at its leaders and members. In 2022, Rian Swiggelaar announced his resignation from the SASC, stating he had experienced a personal spiritual transformation with Jesus Christ. Following this, the church officially closed its doors, but despite its closure, the SASC made history as the first legally recognized satanic religious organization in South Africa, demonstrating the extent of constitutional protections for religious freedom under Section 15 in South Africa. Its impact remains a pivotal case study in religious plurality and freedom of belief in post-apartheid South Africa. Rian Swiggelaar, once the presiding reverend for the South African Satanic Church today, works closely with Adele Frey, another Christian ex-Satanist grifter associated with sensationalist disinformation reminiscent of the apartheid-era satanic panic. Their collaboration has been described as reviving debunked narratives that once fueled moral hysteria by exaggerating apartheid-era falsehoods of ritual crimes and occult activity from an occult elite. This shift stood in stark contrast to the initial SASC's founding mission of rational inquiry, inclusivity, and spiritual autonomy. While Swiggelaar had originally championed this vision of Satanism rooted in critical thinking and personal freedom, his later adoption of alarmist rhetoric undermined both the credibility and public legitimacy of Satanism as belief system. Today, he continues to circulate misinformation, echoing that of the late Rebecca Brown and John Ramirez, about Satanism's structure and practices, showing internal discord and public confusion. As former Gauteng reverend of the SASC and South Africa's leading occult and alternative religious expert, I publicly criticized these actions, arguing that reviving panic-based discourse contradicted Satanism's de facto commitment to constitutional religious freedoms and secular pluralism. Such rhetoric, I maintained and still maintain, not only damaged the SASC's credibility, but also risked reigniting the stigma that the organization ought to transcend against Satanism. Despite mirroring apartheid-era misinformation tactics, Swiggelaar's actions have drawn little criticism for betraying the progressive, inclusive principles that once defined his mandate and the South African Satanic Church's role in South Africa's evolving spiritual landscape. South Africa's subconscious is still malignant and an infectious idea of post-apartheid satanic panic narratives that has been reignited by individuals such as Rian Swiggelaar in South Africa. This is why, as I mentioned earlier, the anti-Satanist scene remains a macabre cash cow. Sorry, my alarm just went off again. Christian fundamentalists who seek reinforcement of their spiritual neuroses. Religious freedom today, the way forward, mapping the future of Section 15 in the South African Constitution 1996. While Section 15 of the South African Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, it does not enforce a strict separation of religion and state, nor does it regulate Christian religious professions, which are often at the forefront of human rights abuses. As such, controversy persists over some schools promoting Christian prayer despite it being illegal for public schools to exclusively associate with a single religious view since 2017. Religious holidays, public holidays, still exclusively favor Christian traditions, for example, Christmas and Easter, and the recognition of non-Christian minority religions. Many minority belief systems still face systemic marginalization, exclusion, and persecution despite legal protections. Evangelical and fundamentalist Christian lobby groups such as the ACDP or African Christian Democratic Party, a political party, including figures like Rian Swiggelaar inter alia, have opposed constitutional protections for alternative spiritualities in South Africa. These groups argue that Satanism, paganism, Wicca, and occultism should not receive equal protection under Section 15. For example, attempts to reintroduce anti-satanic laws or restrict the visibility of occult belief systems in public spaces. Religious freedom in South Africa sometimes also finds itself at odds with public discrimination, particularly regarding same-sex marriage or civil unions, legalized in 2006, but also opposed by many religious groups. LGBTQ individuals, just like religious minorities, are still being denied services by faith-based organizations and sometimes conflated with the influence of an occult cabal. Hate speech disguised as religious opinion, for example, pastors condemning homosexuality, lambasting Muslims, and harassing occult practitioners, still persist in post-1996 constitutional freedom South Africa. However, not all is bleak. Since 1996, numerous diverse pagan and non-pagan groups have emerged across South Africa, embodying the independent and pluralistic spirit that defines the country's modern esoteric movement. As I said earlier, also, no single person or organization can claim to represent all occultists or pagans in South Africa, which is a testament to the movement's diversity and autonomy. While some mainstream media coverage of paganism, Satanism, and witchcraft has become more balanced since 1996, much of it remains sensationalist and perpetuating stigma and misunderstandings. Meaningful public dialogue between occult practitioners and representatives of other faiths have yet to occur within mainstream media. Instead, public discourse about contemporary paganism and related traditions, typically reignited each year around Halloween, especially this year, October, continues to be dominated by Christian commentators whose views often rest on bias and misinformation. Headlines such as "Today the Witches Flew into Parliament" or "Satanic Halloween calendars" trivialize serious religious expression, reducing complex spiritual traditions to objects of ridicule or moral panic caricatures. Such portrayals sustain the marginalization of esoteric belief systems, casting them as a fantastical rather than legitimate expression of religious epistemologies. Yet, there are hopeful signs of change. Independent media initiatives such as the Wild Hunt and the South African Pagan Rights Alliance newsletters, in accompaniment with others, have helped foster a growing, diverse, and globally connected community of pagans and esotericists working to define and strengthen South Africa's esoteric community as a recognized minority religious epistemological community. In honor of all the occultists who have dedicated their energy to the growth of South Africa's public and private esoteric communities, I offer, in perfect love and perfect trust, a libation of blessing to their continued well-being. May all minority religions in South Africa flourish in peace and mutual respect. Examples of a few alternative religious organizations in South Africa: the Druids Order of South Africa, Pagan Freedom Day, South African Pagan Rights Alliance, and the rest. So, a secular way forward, tradition or transgression. Section 15 of the 1996 Constitution therefore still transformed South Africa from a Christian nationalist state under apartheid to a secular democracy that legally protects all religions and non-religious belief systems. This is why, among the groups championing secular discourses, is the South African Secular Society, who awards secularist advocacy annually and trains secular and inclusive marriage officiants. However, tensions remain, as I mentioned earlier, particularly as conservative religious groups continue to resist the full implications of religious pluralism, as well as the headache of South African paganism's growing neo-Nazi or esoteric fascist scene. Throughout this discussion, we have explored several themes around the historical, legal, and cultural dimensions of occult suppression and religious pluralism in South Africa, tracing its trajectory from colonial Christianity and legislation to modern-day satanic panic narratives to a relatively pluralist society. Key themes have therefore emerged, revealing the intersection of jurisprudence or law, spirituality, and misinformation online with new media, as well as the challenges faced by alternative religious movements in a still predominantly Christianized and New Democratic society. The study of occult suppression, esoteric fascination, and fascism, religious freedom, and satanic panic in South Africa reveals a centuries-old struggle between authoritarian religious hegemony and the right to freedom of belief and association in South Africa. Therefore, while the Constitution guarantees protection and South Africa being the host of the G20 Interfaith, the social and political realities in 2025 still show that religious minorities remain underrepresented and excluded from interfaith forums. As such, South African alternative and esoteric religions still have a long road to traverse towards true religious freedom. I thank you.
Thank you. That was very impressive.
Did you manage to see my presentation and my video? Because at some stage I completely just went blank after an alarm of mine went off.
I saw the whole thing.
Okay, perfect.
All right, and let me end the stream. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll be back at 10 o'clock this morning in the United States, Central Daylight Time, and we'll continue on with the Pagan World Conference for the final day. And join me at 2 p.m. tomorrow at Central Daylight for the closing speech. All right, thanks, folks.